Spiritual thoughts of God himself, the opposition to them and neglect of them with their causes in the way of their prevention or their prevalency, predominant corruptions expelling due thoughts of God. How are these things to be discovered? I have spoken very briefly to the first particular instance of the heavenly things that we are to fix our thoughts on, namely the person of Christ. And I've done it on the reason before mentioned, namely that I intend a peculiar treatise on that subject, or an inquiry how we may behold the glory of Christ in this life, and how we shall do so to eternity. That which I have reserved to the last place is to the exercise of their thoughts about who are spiritually minded, is that which is the absolute foundation and spring of all things spiritual, namely God himself. He is the fountain whence all these things proceed, in the ocean in which they issue. He is their center and circumference, in which they all begin, meet, and end. So the apostle issues his profound discourse of the counsels of the divine will and mysteries of the gospel, Romans 11:36. Of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. All things arise from his power, and are all disposed by his wisdom into a tendency to its glory. Of him, and through him, and to him are all things. Under that consideration alone are they to be the objects of our spiritual meditation, namely as they come from him and tend to him. All other things are finite and limited, but they begin and end in that which is immense and infinite. So God is all in all. He therefore is, or ought to be, the only supreme absolute object of our thoughts and desires. Other things are from him and for him only. When our thoughts do not either immediately and directly, or immediately and by just consequence tend to and end in him, they are not spiritual, 1 Peter 1, verse 21. To make way for directions, how to exercise our thoughts on God himself, something must be premised concerning a sinful defect in this, with the causes of it. First, it is the great character of a man presumptuously and flagitiously wicked that God is not in all of his thoughts. Psalm in verse 4, that is, he is in none of them. And of this lack of thoughts of God there are many degrees, for all wicked men are not equally so forgetful of him. Number 1. Some are under the power of atheistical thoughts. They deny or question, or do not avowedly acknowledge the very being of God. This is the height of what the enmity of the carnal mind can rise to. To acknowledge God and yet to refuse to be subject to his law or will, a man would think were as bad, if not worse, and to deny the being of God. But it is not so. That is a rebellion against his authority. This, though, is a hatred to the only fountain of all goodness, truth, and being. And that because they cannot own it, but withal they must acknowledge it to be infinitely righteous, holy, and powerful, which would destroy all their desires and security. Such may be the person in the psalm, for the words may be read, all his thoughts are, that there is no God. However, the context describes him as one who rather despises his providence and denies his being. But such there are, whom the same psalmist everywhere brands for fools, although they themselves seem to suppose that wisdom is born and will die with them. Psalm 14, verse 1, Psalm 53, verse 1. It may be never any age since the flood did so abound with open atheism, among such as pretend to the use and improvement of reason than that in which we live. Among the ancient civilized heathen, we hear ever and anon of a person branded for an atheist, yet we are not certain whether it was done justly or not. But in all nations of Europe at this day, cities, courts, towns, fields, armies abound with persons who, if any credit may be given to what they say or do not believe that there is a God. And the reason of this may be a little inquired into. Now, there is no other reason in general for this, but that men have decocted and wasted the light and power of Christian religion. It is the fullest revelation of God that ever he made. It is the last that ever he will make in this world, if this be despised, if men rebel against the light of it, if they break the cords of it and are senseless of its power, nothing can preserve them from the highest atheism that the natural man is capable of. It is in vain to expect relief or preservation from inferior means when the highest and most noble are rejected. Reason, or the light of nature, gives evidence to the being of God, and arguments are still well pleaded from them to the confusion of atheists. And they were sufficient to retain men in an acknowledgment of the divine power and Godhead, who had no higher evidences of them. But where men have had the benefit of divine revelation, where they have been educated in the principles of the Christian religion, and have had some knowledge and made some profession of them, and have, through the love of sin and hatred of everything that is truly good, rejected all convictions from them concerning the being, power, and rule of God, they will not be kept unto a confession of them by any considerations that the light of nature can suggest. There are therefore, among other 3 reasons, why there are more atheists among them who live where the Christian religion is professed and the power of it is rejected, than among any other sort of men, even than there were among the heathen themselves. God is designed to magnify his word above all of his name, or all other ways of the revelation of himself to the children of men. Psalm 138, verse 2. Where therefore this is rejected and despised, he will not give the honor to reason or the light of nature, that they shall preserve the minds of men from any evil whatever. Reason shall not have the same power and efficacy on the minds of men who reject the light and power of divine revelation by the word, as it has or may have on them whose best guide it is, who never enjoy the light of the gospel, and therefore there is oftentimes more common honesty amongst civilized heathen and Mohammedans and amongst degenerate Christians. And for the same reason, the children of professors are sometimes irrecoverably profligate. It will be said, many are recovered to God by afflictions who have despised the word. But it is otherwise. Never any were converted to God by afflictions who had rejected the word. Men may by afflictions be recalled to the light of the word, but none are immediately turned to God by them. As a good shepherd, when a sheep wanders from the flock and will not hear his call, the shepherd sends out his dog, which steps him and bites him. On this he looks about him, and hearing the call of the shepherd returns again to the flock. Job 33, verses 19 to 25. But with this sort of persons it is a way of God, that when the principal means of the revelation of himself, and in which he most glorifies his wisdom and his goodness, are despised, he will not only take off the efficacy of inferior means, but judicially harden the hearts and blind the eyes of men, that such means shall be of no use to them. See Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10, Acts 13, verses 40 and 41, Romans 1, 21 and 28, and 2 Thessalonians 2, 11 and 12. Number 2, the contempt of gospel light in Christian religion as it is supernatural, which is the beginning of transgression to all atheists amongst us, begets in and leaves on the mind such a depraved, corrupt habit, such a congeries of all evils, that the hatred of the goodness, wisdom, and grace of God can produce, that it cannot but be wholly inclined to the worst of evils, as all our natural vicious inclinations succeeded immediately on our rejection and loss of the image of God in us. The best things corrupted yield the worst savor, as manna stunk, and bred worms. The knowledge of the gospel being rejected, stinking worms take the place of it in the mind, which grow into vipers and scorpions. Every degree of apostasy from gospel truth brings in a proportionate degree of inclination to wickedness into the hearts and minds of men, 2 Peter 2, verse 21. And that which is total to all the evils that they are capable of in this world. Whereas therefore multitudes from their darkness, unbelief, temptation, love of sin, pride, and contempt of God fall off from all subjection of soul and conscience to the gospel, either notionally or practically, deriding or despising all supernatural revelations. They are 1,000 times more disposed to downright atheism than persons who never had the light or benefit of such revelations. Take heed of spiritual decays. Whatever ground the gospel loses in our minds, sin possesses it for itself and its own ends. Let no one say it is otherwise with them. Men grow cold and negligent in the duties of gospel worship, public and private, which is to reject gospel light. Let them say and pretend what they please, that in other things in their minds and conversations it is well with them. Indeed, it is not so. Sin does, one way or other, make an increase in them, proportionate to these decays, and will sooner or later discover itself so to do in themselves if they are not utterly hardened. They may greatly discover it, inwardly in their peace or outwardly in their lives. Where men are resolved not to see, the greater the light is that shines about them, the faster they must close their eyes. All atheism springs from a resolution not to see things invisible and eternal, love of sin, a resolved continuance in the practice of it, the effectual power of vicious inclinations in opposition to all that is good make it the interest of such men that there should be no God to call them to an account. For a supreme, unavoidable judge, an eternal rewarder of good and evil, is inseparable from the first notion of a divine being. Whereas, therefore, the most glorious light and uncontrollable evidence of these things shines forth in the Scripture, men that will abide by their interest to love and live in sin must clothe their eyes with all the arts and powers that they have, or else it will pierce into their minds to their torment. This they do by downright atheism, which alone pretends to give them security against the light of divine revelation. Against all other convictions they might take shelter from their fears under less degrees of it. It is not therefore to the disparagement but honor of the gospel that so many avow themselves to be atheists, in those places in which the truth of it is known and professed. For none can have the least inclination or temptation to this until they have beforehand rejected the gospel, which immediately exposes them to the worst of evils. Nor is there any means for the recovery of such persons. The opposition that has been made to atheism with arguments for the divine being and existence of God, taken from reason and natural light, in this and other ages has been of good use to cast contempt on the pretenses of evil men to justify themselves in their folly. But that they have so much as changed the minds of any, I much doubt. No man is under the power of atheistical thoughts, or can be so long, but he that is ensnared into them by his desire to live securely and uncontrollably in sin. Such persons know it to be their interest that there should be no God, and are willing to take shelter under the bold expressions and reasonings of them who by the same means have hardened and blinded their minds into such foolish thoughts. But the most rational arguments for the being of the deity will never prove an effectual cure to a predominant love of and habitual course in sin, in them who have resisted and rejected the means and motives to that end declared in divine revelation. And unless a love of sin be cured in the heart, thoughts and the acknowledgement of God will not be fixed in the mind. Number 2. There are those of whom also it may be said that God is not in all their thoughts, though they acknowledge his essence and being, for they are not practically influenced in anything by the notions they have of him. Such is a person of whom this is affirmed, Psalm 10, verse 4. He is one who, through pride and profligacy, with hardness and sin, regards not God and the rule of the world. Psalm 10, verses 4, 5, 11, and 13. Such is a world filled with at this day, as they are described, Titus 1, verse 16. They profess that they know God, but in works deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and to every good work reprobate. They think and live and act in all things as if there were no God, at least as if they never thought of him with fear and reverence. And for the most part, we don't need to seek far for evidences of their disregard of God. The pride of their countenances testifies against them. Psalm 10, verse 4. And if they are followed further, cursed oaths, licentiousness of life, and hatred of all that is good will confirm and evidence the same. Such as these may own God in words, may be afraid of him in dangers, may attend outwardly on his worship, but they think not of God at all in a due manner. He is not in all their thoughts. Number 3. There are yet less degrees of this disregard of God and forgetfulness of him. Some are so filled with thoughts of the world and the occasions of life that it is impossible they should think of God as they ought. For as the love of God and the love of the world in prevalent degrees are inconsistent. For if a man love this world, how dwells the love of God in him? So thoughts of God and of the world in the like degree are inconsistent. This is the state of many, who yet would be esteemed spiritually minded. They are continually conversant in their minds about earthly things. Some things impose themselves on them under the notion of duty. They belong to their callings, they must be attended to. Some are suggested to their minds from daily occasions and occurrences. Commonly converse in the world engages men into no other but worldly thoughts. Love and desire of earthly things, their enjoyment and increase, exhaustive vigor of their spirits all the day long. In the midst of a multitude of thoughts arising from these and the like occasions, whilst their hearts and heads are reeking with esteem of them, many fall immediately in their seasons to the performance of holy duties. Those times must suffice for thoughts of God. But, notwithstanding such duties, what through the lack of a due preparation for them, or through the fullness of their minds and affections with other things, and through a neglect of exercising grace in them, it may be said comparatively that God is not in all their thoughts. I pray God that this, at least as to some degrees of it, be not the condition of many among us. I speak not now of men who visibly and openly live in sin, are profane in their principles, and profligate in their lives. The prayers of such persons are an abomination to the Lord, neither have they ever any thoughts of him which he accepts. But I speak of them who are sober in their lives, industrious in their callings, and not openly negligent about the outward duties of religion. Such men are apt to approve of themselves, and others also to speak well of them. For these things are in themselves commendable and praiseworthy. But if they are traced home, it will be found as to many of them that God is not in all of their thoughts as he ought to be. Their earthly conversation, their vain communication with their foolish designs do all manifest the vigor of their spirits, and most intense contrivances of their minds are engaged to things below. Some refuse. Transient, unmanaged thoughts are sometimes cast away on God, which he despises. Number 4. Where persons cherish secret, predominant lust in their hearts and lives, God is not in their thoughts as he ought to be. He may be. He often is much in the words of such persons, but in their thoughts he is not. He cannot be in a due manner. And such persons, no doubt, there are. Ever and anon we hear of one and another whose secret lusts break forth into a discovery. They flatter themselves for a season, but God oftentimes shall order things in his holy providence that their iniquity shall be found out to be hateful. Some hateful lust discovers itself to be predominant in them. One is drunken, another unclean, a third an oppressor. Such were ever found amongst professors of the gospel, and that in the best of times among the apostles one was a traitor, a devil. Of the first professors of Christianity there were those whose God was their belly, whose end was destruction, who minded earthly things, Philippians 3 verses 18 and 19. Some may take advantage of this acknowledgement that there are such evils among such as are called professors. And it must be confessed that great scandal is given by this to the world, casting both them that give it and them to whom it is given under a most dreadful woe. But we must bear the reproach of it as they did of old, and commit the issue of all things to the watchful care of God. However, it is good in such a season to be jealous over ourselves and others, to exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Hebrews 3, verse 13. C. Hebrews chapter 12, 13 to 17. And because those with whom it is thus cannot be spiritually minded, and yet there are some difficulties in the case as to the predominancy of a secret lust or sin, I shall consider it somewhat more distinctly. We must distinguish between the time of temptation in some and the ordinary state of mind and affections in others. There may be a season in which God, in his holy wise ordering of all things towards us, and for his own glory, in his holy blessed ends, may suffer a lust or corruption to break loose in the heart, to strive, tempt, suggest, tumultuate into the great trouble and disquietude of the mind and conscience. Neither can it be denied but that, fallen in conjunction with some vigorous temptation, it may proceed so far as to surprise a person in whom it is into actual sin, to his defilement and amazement. In this case no man can say, I am tempted of God, for God tempts no man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. But yet temptations of what sort soever they be, so far as they are afflictive, corrective, or penal, are ordered and disposed by God himself, for there is no evil of that nature, and he has not done it. And where he will have the power of any corruption to be afflictive in any instance, two things may safely be ascribed to him. 1. God withholds the supplies of that grace in which it might be effectually mortified and subdued. He can give in a sufficiency of efficacious grace to repel any temptation, to subdue any or all our lusts and sins, for he can and does work in us to will and to do according to his pleasure. Ordinarily he does so in them that believe, so that although their lusts may rebel in war, they cannot defile or prevail. But to the continual supplies of this actual prevailing grace he is not obliged. When it may have a tendency to his holy ends, he may and does withhold it. When it may be a proud soul is to be humbled, a careless soul to be awakened, and an unthankful soul to be convinced and rebuked, a backsliding soul to be recovered, a froward, selfish, passionate soul to be broken and meekened, he can leave them for a season to the sore exercise of a prevalent corruption, which under his holy guidance shall contribute greatly to his blessed ends. It was so in the temptation of Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 and 9. If a man through disorder and excesses is contracting many habitual distempers of body, which gradually and insensibly tend to his death, it may be an advantage to be cast into a violent fever which threatens immediately to take away his life. For he will by this be thoroughly awakened to the consideration of his danger, and not only labor to be freed from his fever, but also for the future to watch against those disorders and excesses which cast him into that condition. And sometimes a loose, careless soul that walks in a secure formal profession contracts many spiritual diseases, which tend to death and ruin. No arguments or considerations can prevail with him to awaken himself, to shake himself out of the dust, and to betake himself to a more diligent and humble walking before God. In this state, it may be, through the permission of God, he is surprised into some open actual sin. Hereon, through the vigorous actings of an enlightened conscience and the stirrings of any sparks of grace which yet remained, he is amazed, terrified, and stirs up himself to seek after deliverance. God may and doth as well in his providence administer objects and occasions of men's lust for their trial. He will place him in such relations and such circumstances as shall be apt to provoke their affections, passions, desires, and inclinations to those objects that are suited to them. In this state, any lust will quickly get such power in the mind and affections as to manage continual solicitations to sin. It will not only dispose the affections towards it, but multiply thoughts about it, and darken the mind as to those considerations which ought to prevail to its mortification. In this condition it is hard to conceive how God should be in the thoughts of man in a due manner. However, this state is very different from the habitual prevalency of any secret sin or corruption in the ordinary course of men's walking in the world. If anyone shall inquire how we may know this difference, namely, that is between the occasional prevalency of any lust or corruption, in conjunction with the temptation, and a power of sin in any instance habitually and constantly complied with or indulged in the mind, I answer first, it is no great matter whether we are able to distinguish between them or not, for the end why God allows such corruptions to be such a snare and temptation, such a thorn and briar, is to awaken the souls of men out of their carnal security, and to humble them for their pride and negligence. The more severe their apprehensions concerning it, the more effectual it will be to this end and purpose. It is good, it may be, that the soul should apprehend more of what is sinful in it as to its corruption than what is afflictive in it as to its temptation. For if it be conceived as a predominant lust, if there be any spark of grace remaining in the soul, it will not rest until in some measure it be subdued. It will also immediately put it upon a diligent search into itself, which will issue in deep self-abasement, the principal end design. But secondly, for the relief of them that may be perplexed in their minds about their state and condition, I say there is an apparent difference between the things. A lust or corruption arising up or breaking forth into a violent temptation is the continual burden, grief, and affliction of the soul in which it is, and is the temptation, for the most part, which befalls such a person will give him no rest from its reiterated solicitations. So he will give the temptation no rest, but will be continually conflicting with it and contending against it. It fills the soul with an amazement at itself and a continual self-abhorrency, that any such seeds of filth and folly should be yet remaining in it. With them in whom any sin is ordinarily prevalent, it is otherwise. According to their light and renewed occasional convictions have trouble about it, they cannot but have so, unless their consciences are utterly seared. But this trouble respects principally, if not solely, its guilt and effects. They know not what may ensue on their compliance with it in this world and another. Beyond this they like it well enough, and are not willing to part with it. It is this latter sea of persons of whom we speak at present. Number 2, we must distinguish between the perplexing solicitation of any lust and the conquering predominancy of it. The evil that is present with us will be soliciting and pressing to sin of its own accord, even when there is no special temptation as that spoken of before. So is the case stated, so are the nature and operations of it described, Romans 7, Galatians 5, verse 17. And sometimes a special particular lust may be so warmed and fomented by men's constitutions within, or be so exposed to provoking and exciting occasions without, as to bring perpetual trouble on the mind. Yet this may be where no sin has a predominancy inquired after. And the difference between the perplexing solicitation of any corruption to sin and the conquering prevalency of it lies in this, that under the former the thoughts, contrivances, and actings of the mind are generally disposed and inclined to, in opposition to it, in a conflict with it, how it may be obviated, defeated, destroyed, how an absolute victory may be obtained against it. Yea, death itself is sweet to such persons, under this notion, as it is that which will deliver them from the perplexing power of their corruptions. So is the state of such a soul at large represented in Romans 7. In the other case, namely of its predominancy, it disposes of the thoughts actually, for the most part, to make provision for the flesh, and to fulfill it in the lust thereof. It fills the minds with pleasing contemplations of its object, and puts it on contrivances for satisfaction. A part of the bitterness of death to such persons is that it will make an everlasting separation between them and the satisfaction they have received in their lust. It is bitter in the thoughts of it to a worldly-minded man, because it will take him from all of his enjoyments, his wealth, profits, and advantages. It is so to the sensual person as that which finally determines all his pleasures. Number 3. There is a difference in the degrees of such predominant corruption. In some it taints the affections, vitiates the thoughts, and works over the will to acts of a secret complacency and sin. But it proceeds no further. The whole mind may be vitiated by it, and rendered in a multitude of its thoughts vain, sensual, or worldly, according as is the nature of the prevailing corruption. Yet here God puts bounds to the raging of some men's corruptions, and says to their proud ways, Thus far shall you proceed and no further. He either lays a restraint on their minds, that when lust is fully conceived it shall not bring forth sin, or he sets a hedge before them in his providence, that they shall not be able in their circumstances to find their way to what perhaps they do most earnestly desire. A woeful life it is that such persons lead. They are continually tortured between their corruptions and convictions, or the love of sin and fear of the event. With others it pursues its course into outward actual sins, which in some are discovered in this world, and others they are not. For some men's sins go before them to judgment, and some follow after. Some fall into sin upon a surprisal into it, from a concurrence of temptation with corruption and opportunities. Some habituate themselves to a course in sin, though in many it be not discovered, in some it is. But among those who have received any spiritual light, and made profession of religion thereon, it seldom falls out but from the great displeasure of God. For when men have long given way to the prevalency of sin in their affections, inclinations, and thoughts, and God has set many a hedge before them to give bounds to their inclinations, and to shut up the womb of sin, sometimes by afflictions, sometimes by fears and dangers, sometimes by the word, and yet the bent of their spirits is towards their sin. God takes off his hand of restraint, removes his hindrances, and gives them up to their own heart's lust, to do the things that are not convenient. All things in this suit their desires, and they rush into actual sins and follies, setting their feet in the paths that go down to the chambers of death. The uncontrollable power of sin in such persons, and the greatness of God's displeasures against them, make their condition most deplorable. Those that are in this state of either sort, the first or the latter, are remote from being spiritually minded, nor is God in all their thoughts as he ought to be. For first, they will not so think and meditate on God. Their delight is turned another way. Their affections, which are the spring of their thoughts, which feed them continually, do cleave to the things which are most adverse to him. Love of sin has gotten to be the spring in them, and the whole stream of the thoughts which they choose and delight in are towards the pleasures of it. If any thoughts of God come in, as a faint tide for a few minutes, and drive back the other stream, they are quickly repelled and carried away with the strongest current of those which proceed from their powerful inclinations. Yet may such persons abide in the performance of outward holy duties or attendance on them. Pride of, or satisfaction in their gifts may give them delight in their own performances, and something in those of others they may be exceedingly pleased with, as it is expressly affirmed. Ezekiel 33, verses 31 and 32. But in these things they have no immediate real thoughts of God, none that they delight in, none that they seek to stir up in themselves, and those which impose themselves on them they reject. Secondly, as they will not, so they dare not think of God. They will not because of the power of their lust, they dare not because of their guilt. No sooner should they begin to think of him in good earnest, but their sin would lose all of its desirable forms and appearances, and represent itself in the horror of guilt alone. And in that condition all the properties of the divine nature are suited to increase the dread and terror of the sinner. Adam had heard God's voice before with delight and satisfaction, but on the hearing of the same voice after he had sinned, he hid himself and cried that he was afraid. There is a way for men to think of God with the guilt of sin upon them, which they intend to forsake. but none for any to do it with the guilt of sin which they resolve to continue in. Therefore, of all these sorts of persons it may be said that God is not in all their thoughts, and therefore are they far enough from being spiritually minded, for unless we have many thoughts of God, we cannot be so. Yea, as well, there are two things required to those thoughts which we have of God, that there be an evidence of our being so. 1. That we take delight in them, Psalm 30, verse 4. Saying to the Lord, O ye saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. The remembrance of God delights and refreshes the hearts of his saints, and stirs them up to thankfulness. First, they rejoice in what God is in himself, whatever is good, amiable, or desirable, whatever is holy, just, and powerful, whatever is gracious, wise, and merciful, and all that is so, they see and apprehend in God. That God is what he is a matter of their chiefest joy. Whatever befall them in this world, whatever troubles and disquietment they are exercised with, the remembrance of God is a satisfactory refreshment to them. For in this they behold all that is good and excellent, the infinite center of all perfections. Wicked men would have God to be anything but what he is, nothing that God is really and truly pleaseth them. Therefore they either frame false notions of him in their minds, as Psalm 1 verse 21, or they don't think of him at all, at least not as they ought, unless sometimes they tremble at his anger and power. Some benefit they suppose may be had by what he can do, but how there can be any delight in what he is, they do not know. Yea, all their trouble arises from this, that he is what he is. It would be a relief to them if they could make any abatement of his power, his holiness, his righteousness, his omnipresence. But his saints, as the psalmist speaks, give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. And when we can delight in the thoughts of what God is in himself, of his infinite excellencies and perfections, it gives us a threefold evidence of our being spiritually minded. First, in that it is such an evidence that we have of a gracious interest in those excellencies and perfections, in which we can say with rejoicing in ourselves, this God, thus holy, thus powerful, thus just, good, and gracious is our God forever and ever, and he will be our guide unto death. So the psalmist, under the consideration of his own frailty and apprehensions of death in the midst of his years, comforts and refreshes himself with thoughts of God's eternity and immutability, with his interest in them. Psalm 102, verses 23 to 28. And God himself proposes to us his infinite immutability as a ground in which we may expect safety and deliverance, Malachi 3, verse 6. When we can thus think of God as what he is with delight, it is an evidence that we have a gracious covenant interest even in what God is in himself, which none have, but those who are spiritually minded. Secondly, it is an evidence that the image of God has begun to be wrought in our own souls, and that we approve of and rejoice in it more than in all other things whatever. Whatever notions men have or may have of the divine goodness, holiness, righteousness, and purity, they are all but barren, jejune, and fruitless, unless there be a similitude and conformity to them wrought in their minds and souls. Without this they cannot rejoice in the thoughts and remembrance of the divine excellencies. Therefore, when we can do so, when such meditations of God are sweet to us, it is an evidence that we have some experience in ourselves of the excellency of the image of those perfections, and that we rejoice in them above all things in this world. Thirdly, there so also, in that they manifest that we do discern and judge that our eternal blessedness consists in the full manifestation and our enjoyment of God, and what he is, and of all of his divine excellencies. This men for the most part take for granted, but how it should be so they do not know. They understand it in some measure, whose hearts are here deeply affected with delight in them. They are able to believe that the manifestation and enjoyment of the divine excellencies will give eternal rest, satisfaction, and complacency to their souls. No wicked man can look upon it Otherwise then is a torment to abide forever with eternal holiness, Isaiah 33, verse 14. And we ourselves can have no present prospect into the fullness of future glory when God shall be all in all, but through the delight and satisfaction which we have here in the contemplation of what God is in himself, is the center of all divine perfections. I would therefore press this unknown, this neglected duty on the minds of those of us, and in a special manner who are visibly drawing nigh to eternity. The days are coming in which what God is in himself, that is, as manifested and exhibited in Christ, shall alone be, as we hope, the eternal blessedness and reward of our souls. Is it possible that anything should be more necessary for us, more useful to us, than to be exercised in such thoughts and contemplations? The benefits we may have by this are not to be reckoned. Some of them only may be named as first. We shall have the best trial of ourselves, how our hearts really stand affected towards God. For if upon examination we find ourselves not really to delight and rejoice in God for what he is in himself, and that all perfections are eternally resident in him, how dwells the love of God in us? But if we can truly rejoice at the remembrance of his holiness and the thoughts of what he is, our hearts are upright with him. Secondly, this is that which will effectually take off our thoughts and affections from things here below. One's spiritual view of the divine goodness, beauty, and holiness will have more efficacy to raise the heart to a contempt of all earthly things than any other evidences whatever. Thirdly, it will increase the grace of being heavenly minded in us, on the grounds before declared. Fourthly, it is the best, I almost said it is the only preparation for the future full enjoyment of God. This will gradually lead us into his presence, take away all fears of death, increase our longing after eternal rest, and ever make us groan to be unclothed. Let us not then cease laboring with our hearts until through grace we have a spiritually sensible delight in enjoying the remembrances and thoughts of what God is in himself. Secondly, in thoughts of God, his saints rejoice at the remembrance of what he is, and what he will be to them. In this they have regard to all the holy relations that he has taken on himself towards them, with all the effects of his covenant in Christ Jesus. To that purpose were some of the last words of David, 2 Samuel 23, verse 5. Although my house be not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire. In the prospect he had of all the distresses that were to befall his family, he triumphantly rejoiced in the everlasting covenant that God had made with him. In these thoughts his saints take delight. They are sweet to them and full of refreshment. Their meditations of him are sweet, and they are glad in the Lord. Psalm 104, verse 34. Thus is it with them that are truly spiritually minded. They not only think much of God, but they take delight in the thoughts. They are sweet to them. And not only so, but they have no solid joy or delight, but in their thoughts of God, which therefore they retreat to continually. They do so especially on great occasions, which of themselves are apt to divert them from them. And suppose a man has received a signal mercy, with the manner of it, he is exceedingly affected and delighted. The minds of some men are apt on such occasions to be filled with thoughts of what they have received, and their affections to be wholly taken up with it. But he who is spiritually minded will immediately retreat to thoughts of God, placing his delight and taking up his satisfaction in him. And so, on the other side, great distresses, prevalent sorrows, strong pains, violent distempers are apt of themselves to take up and exercise all the thoughts of men about them. But those who are spiritually minded will, in and under them, all continually betake themselves to thoughts of God, in which they find relief and refreshment against all that they feel or fear. In every state their principal joy is in the remembrance of his holiness. That they, secondly, be accompanied with godly fear and reverence. These are required of us in all in which we have to do with God. Hebrews 12, verses 28 and 29. And as the Scripture doth not more abound with precepts to any duty, so the nature of God and our own, with the infinite distance between them, makes it indispensably necessary, even in the light of the natural conscience. Infinite greatness, infinite holiness, infinite power, all which God is, command the utmost reverential fear that our natures are capable of. The lack of this is a spring of innumerable evils, yea, indeed, of all that is so. Hence our blasphemous abuses of the holy name of God in cursed oaths and execrations. Hence it is taken in vain in ordinary exclamations. Hence is all formality in religion. It is the spiritual mind alone that can reconcile those things which are prescribed to us as our duty towards God. To delight and rejoice in him always, to triumph in the remembrance of him, to draw near to him with boldness and confidence, are on the one hand prescribed to us, and on the other it is so that we fear and tremble before him, that we fear that great and dreadful name, the Lord our God, that we have grace to serve him with reverence and godly fear, because he is a consuming fire. The things carnal reason can comprehend no consistency in. What the mind is afraid of, it cannot delight in, and what it delights in, it will not long fear. But the consideration of faith concerning what God is in himself and what he will be to us gives this different degrees or distinct operations, and a blessed reconciliation in our souls. Therefore all our thoughts of God ought to be accompanied with a holy awe and reverence from a due sense of his greatness, holiness, and power. Two things will utterly vitiate all thoughts of God and render them useless to us: vain curiosity and carnal boldness. First, it is unimaginable how the subtle disquisitions and disputes of men about the nature, properties, and counsels of God have been corrupted, rendered sapless and useless, by vain curiosity, and striving for an artificial accuracy in the expression of men's apprehensions. When the wits and minds of men are engaged in such thoughts, God is not in all their thoughts, even when all their thoughts are concerning whom. When once men are got into their metaphysical curiosities and logical niceties and their contemplations about God and his divine properties, they bid farewell, for the most part, to all godly fear and reverence. Secondly, others are so under the power of carnal boldness that they think of God with no other respect than if they thought of worms of the earth like themselves. There is no holy awfulness upon their minds and souls in the mention of his name. By these things may our thoughts of God be so vitiated that the heart shall not in them be affected with a reverence of him, nor any evidence be given that we are spiritually minded. It is this holy reverence that is a means of bringing in sanctifying virtue into our souls from God upon our thoughts of him. None that thinks of God with a due reverence, but he shall be sensible of advantage by it. By this do we sanctify God in our access to him. And when we do so, he will sanctify and purify our hearts by those very thoughts in which we draw nigh to him. We may have many sudden, occasional, transient thoughts of God that are not introduced into our minds by a preceding reverential fear. But if they do not leave that fear on our hearts in proportion to their continuance with us, they are of no value, but will insensibly habituate us to a common bold frame of spirit which he despises. So is it in the case of thoughts of a contrary nature. Thoughts of sin as sinful objects may arise in our minds from the remainders of corruption, or be occasioned by the temptations and suggestions of Satan. If these are immediately rejected and cast out of us, the soul is not more prejudiced by their entrance than it is advantaged by their rejection through the power of grace. But if they make frequent returns into the minds of men, or make any abode or continuance in their soliciting of the affections, they greatly defile the mind and conscience, disposing the person to the further entertainment of them. So, if our occasional thoughts of God immediately leave us, and pass away with much affecting our minds, we shall have little or no benefit by them. But if, by their frequent visits and some continuance with us, they dispose our souls to a holy reverence of God, They are a blessed means of promoting our sanctification. Without this, there may be thoughts of God, to no advantage of the soul. There is implanted on our nature such a sense of the divine power and presence as that all on a sudden occasions and surprisals it will act itself according to that sense and apprehension. There is a voice in nature itself upon anything that is suddenly too hard for it, which cries out immediately to the God of nature. So men on such occasions, without any consideration, are surprised into a calling on the name of God and crying to him. And from the same natural apprehension it is that wicked and profane persons will break forth on all occasions into curse swearing by his name. So men in such ways have thoughts of God without either reverence or godly fear, without giving any glory to him, and for the most part to their own disadvantage. Such are all thoughts of God that are not accompanied with holy fear and reverence. There is hardly any duty that ought at present to be more pressed on the consciences of men than this of keeping up a constant holy reverence of God in all in which they have to do with him, both in private and public, in their inward thoughts and outward communication. For a malady is so prevailed on religion, and that under the most effectual means of its suppression, that very many manifest that they have little or no reverence of God in the most solemn duties of his worship, unless it may be in their secret thoughts. Some ways that have been found out to keep up a pretense and appearance of it have been and are destructive to it. But in this consists the very life of all religion. The fear of God is, in the Old Testament, the usual expression of all the due respect of our souls to him, and that because where that is not an exercise, nothing is accepted with him. And so the whole of our wisdom is said to consist in this, and if it be not in a prevalent exercise in all in which we have to do with him immediately, all our duties are utterly lost as to the ends of its glory, and the spiritual advantage of our own souls.